Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we are looking once again, for like the 10th time, I'm pretty sure of it, looking at M.2 NVMe storage pools on the brand new Synology DS923, and in today's video we're going to be running a series of performance tests. Now, it should be highlighted if you didn't already catch my previous video on this subject. Currently, at the time of recording, or at least as far as my testing indicated, you can only take advantage of Synology SSDs on the M.2 NVMe Bays of the DS923 to turn them into storage pools. We've got two of them inside here. They are the SNV 3400 400 gig drives, and if we open up the storage manager here, as you can see on screen, I think I'm probably at the top right of the screen, kind of, so it should be down there somewhere. You can see right there, we've got our storage pool, and if we look at the available drives, we've got two drives there, and first thing you may notice is I've only used one drive. Now, a few things straight off the bat. As like in my previous video, which was filmed for me about 3 hours ago, I am quite closely packed in here. I've got a Sonic 10G to Thunderbolt adapter going into the laptop. I've got the PSU and the fans of the laptop, and I've got the Synology DS923 slightly off shot. So there's a lot of ambient noise here, and I will try to remove as much as I can in post-production, but it's going to be very tough. I've tried to get him nice and close with the mic, so I apologise if any of that background hum of the enterprise drives that are inside and just generally the fans that are around me kind of ruin some of the audio there for you. The second thing I will highlight, you may have noticed earlier on, is that the system is throwing me a storage warning. Now, again, this is nothing to do with the SSDs, nothing to do with the drives. This is because I migrated my drives over from a DS1522 when I was getting ready for the testing. You may have seen that in the other video, and I need to perform a scrub just to check that there were no inconsistencies on that. But if I do that, there's a lot of things I can't do with the NAS during this testing. It would take about 2 days to finish the consistency and scrubbing of this system with those 16 TB drives. So rather than delay the video production another couple of days, I've decided to forgo that, because we're not going to be using the hard drives in today's tests. We're only going to be looking at the SSDs. So don't worry about that with the orange right in there. It's perfectly fine. We are using Synology's own drives, as you can see there. Now, today's testing is going to be broken down into 3 preset areas. The first barrage of tests are going to be utilising Atto Disk Benchmark, AJA Speed Test and Black Magic on a single M.2 NVMe Synology SNV 3400 400 gig drive in its own independent pool. There's no RAID, no fallback, and we've got the drive on its own. If we go into the storage area there for pool 2, you can see it is just a single drive, which we haven't set up in any kind of massive RAID. We've used SHR for scalability, but that's about it. Now we've set it up, we've gone ahead and created a shared folder on this area, because we created a volume as well. That shared folder on volume 2 there, as you can see, I haven't got any crazy kind of setup on that. We're not using an iSCSI LUN for this one, because we're going to be using that in another one using iPerf. But the shared drive, as you can see there, we've got it set up on volume 2, and on top of that, this system is also taking advantage of that 10 GBE upgrade there. So if we go to the info center, we can scroll down, and as you can see, we're running that 10 GBE connection there. At the same time, on my Windows PC, I've got it connected here on the Sonic 10G Thunderbolt adapter. And again, as you can see, if we go to the status, we are running a 10 gigabits per second setup. And if we go to the properties, we're able to ascertain that we have opened up MTU or Jumbo frames, as it's otherwise known, at 9000. And indeed, I've done exactly that same thing on the Synology as well. If we go back to the storage monitor, go into the network settings there, you're able to see on the interface, there's our 10G, and 10G set with MTU at 9000 there. So we've done all of that setting up for our storage. On top of that, I've also used the Synology Assistant application to find the NAS on the 169 IP, so you can ignore where it says 192 up here. Connected on the 169 IP there. We also have, on the My folder there, we've set up this mapped network drive. As you can see there, it's going on the IP 169.254.159.12, and that is this drive connected on 10 GBE. So that's the setup for our testing, all the connected services, and from there we can run our tests. Now, much like my other video, one of the biggest problems we're going to face while doing these tests is, of course, OBS. It has an impact on performance, which means if I run the tests while recording, it can take a hit. I could have used an external capture card, but that's currently being used for Plex testing for another video, and it's a big setup to dismantle. So what I've done is I've already committed all of the tests in advance. But before I do that, I just want to show you what I mean by a dropping in performance. So if we go ahead and select that shared drive that we got over the network, and we'll go for, let's go for something quick. So we'll go for a 64 megabyte test there. While that runs in the background, you'll see later on how that performance compares against the ones that I've already done, like the old BBC TV shows. Here's something I made earlier, how it compares without OBS. Now, before I bring that up on screen, I will highlight another thing. After we've gone through the tests of Atto, AJA and Blackmagic on this setup, I'm going to go ahead and format that shared drive, and then I'm going to create a RAID 0 with 2 of the drives just to show some comparison of performance. Then I'm going to repeat those tests again, but this time in a RAID 1 environment, a mirror, just to give you some idea of the performance possible. Now, before, those of you in the comments will immediately go, you're connected via 10 GBE. Those drives are faster than 10 GBE. What you're doing is pointless. Go away, dislike, etc. Bear in mind that a lot of the time, when we're going for the smaller file formats over 10 GBE, you're right, they will almost certainly fully saturate a 1 gigabyte external connection, or 10 gigabit. However, once we go to the more complex files, the 4, the 8, the 16 gigabyte test files, these are ones where the performance benefits of a RAID will present themselves. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, we do have tests coming up where we're going to be looking at the internal performance, and that is where any kind of bottleneck that external 10 GBE will not be present for. But for now, these are external 10 GBE tests, and this is really to see just how much of the NVMe performance we have access to within the Synology system there. Now, we're about halfway through, give or take, those Atto tests there in front of us, and we've just started breaking into the gigabyte there. So again, we are fully saturating that connection without a RAID and just a single drive there. Now, what we'll do is we'll bring up some of my earlier tests. Now, these are the exact same tests that we're seeing here, but these tests were done without OBS screen recorder running. So if we put these side by side, and we'll put the one that's currently running down here, we can see straight away there, let's get away from the IOPS because we can look at the IOPS, that when it comes to the performance there of the three, when we look at the 64 meg, so we've got the one that's testing down here in the corner, the performance was a great deal more consistent because of the lack of OBS, but it was still able to saturate that 10 gigabit or 1 gigabyte threshold very comfortably, almost consistently in read performance there. Write performance, however, as it's already been dictated and already highlighted in other videos, the write performance of the Synology SMV3400 leaves a little to be desired. It definitely is a drive that prioritizes read over write, and I imagine now Synology are enabling this feature that they will release a faster version of this to add to the family. But as you can see there, as the test is continuing, that the numbers are still pretty darn high, even with OBS running in the background there. So, you know, we'll leave that running there in the background. I'm going to cancel that test there because we don't need to run it while we've already got these other results on screen. But straight away, if we look at the 64 meg, 256 meg and 1 gigabyte file, we can see that in terms of read, we almost completely saturated the 10 GBE connection, you know, consistently. But in the write performance, that's where we started to see the dip. We started to see, although in the smaller file type and the less complex, less dense files, we were still in, you know, the high 900s in a lot of places. When it came to the more complex files, the minute we got to the 1 gigabyte file, which is, you know, the tunnel that we're dealing with, we can see that performance jump down to the 600s there. Now, what about if we exceed the 1 gigabyte? Well, then we can look at these two results here. Now, these two results are results that take advantage, as you can see, of a 4 gig and a 16 gigabyte test file there. And as you can see, this is where we started to see the performance there in terms of read performance start to fail at fully saturating the 10 GB connection with just one drive inside. So as you can see, down there we started to see the 600s and 700s, and even broke into the 500s with the big 16 GB sequential test. Now remember, these are synthetic tests, but still nonetheless, that one drive was still giving us tremendous throughput, just a single NVMe, when not a few days ago I was working on RAID 5 hard drive performance numbers just to get even close to a lot of these figures on here. Now, while we're looking at this, it is worth highlighting, while we're dealing with an SSD, that let's get rid of that one, we can talk a little bit about IOPS. Clearly, as it's an SSD, we are going to have decent enough IOPS numbers to play with there, but it was fairly consistent, and I think a lot to do with the file types we were dealing with. We weren't dealing with 4K random or anything like that, so consequently, the IOPS numbers, at least in the context of this test, are less relevant. So next up, let's look at AJA. Now, AJA is more of a multimedia benchmark tool, so we'll bring that up there. We had 4 tests run in total. So the first test, the 256 megabyte test there, and again, complete full saturation, absolutely fine. The next test, if we go along the scope, was again, let's move that there, bring that up to the right, hopefully my head's not in the way, and that's 800 over 1000, so very close to full saturation in both read and write. Lovely results there. Next up, we can make our way into the third test, and again, this time a bigger file. This time we're looking at a 4 gig file, and that's where we start to see saturation with this single drive not quite so competent at 6 over 500 there. And finally, the biggest file at 16 gigabytes in size. This one right here at the end, let's bring it up to the top, is pretty much down the middle for the most part for our 10 gigabytes per second connection. All of these running on that remote drive, and these are 1080p test files there. So finally, we can look at Blackmagic. Now, Blackmagic is one that we can't really do multiple screens for. As you can see here, while we were running a 1 gigabyte test file there on the targeted drive, we had 900 over 1056. But indeed, I was able to perform several tests in the background there, and when it came to Blackmagic, we were able to perform a 5 gigabyte test file, as you can see there on screen, a 3 gigabyte test file there, and then finally there was my original 1 gigabyte test file. So what we can take from this is that with a single drive, we can still get quite a lot of performance from that PCIe slot there. But what about if we use a RAID 0 environment? We combine those drives together in order to find out how the performance levies then. Will we see greater performance on the larger sequential data? Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and remove that existing storage pool there and now turn it into a RAID 0 environment and run all of my tests again. For me, that's going to take about 45 minutes. For you, it's going to be mere moments. Let's fast forward. Okay, so how was that for you? For me, it's been the better part of an hour, but I've got the RAID set up. I've created a new RAID with the 2 drives there in a RAID 0 environment and done a bunch of tests just to once again confirm we're using a brand new RAID here. This is the RAID 0 there of our 2 drives there on volume 2. That's the shared folder. If we go down to the bottom, you can see here that we've already created that 2 drive RAID. It's a RAID 0 environment. We've got them combined, even created the volume. Again, max capacity. We've taken advantage of the full available capacity there. We're still using the 10 gigabit Ethernet connection between these 2 devices, and I've run a bunch of tests just like last time. And once again, because we've got OBS, again, it's going to affect performance. So just to put it into perspective, this time what I'm going to do while I'm talking to you is I'm going to run Blackmagic non-stop. So just to put it into perspective, again, we could fully saturate it as exactly as we suspected. This was the 5 gigabyte test there. You can see utilizing that target drive. The target drive in question, as you can see, was that shared drive there. So what I'm going to do while I go through some of the other results, again, I'm just going to run that there in the background and let it do its thing there at the corner. And immediately, as you can see, we're seeing that impact of OBS running once again. But while it does that, let's go through all the other results. I will tell you straight away off the bat, full saturation of the 10 gigabit Ethernet or 1 gigabyte connection was pretty much consistent, even in the lower capacities there. As you can see there on screen, and again, I'll try and angle Blackmagic so it remains there at the bottom of the screen. If we go for the smaller capacities of 64 meg, 256 meg and 1 gig, you can see there once again read absolute saturation, just complete filling there. And at the same time there at the bottom of the write performance there, we saw much higher numbers, consistently living in the 900 to 1000 megabytes per second throughout. Now again, if we make our way onto the 4 gig and the 16 gig test files there, this is where we saw a tremendous drop before, and we can see immediately there that although full consistent 1 gigabyte read saturation wasn't quite achieved, we got real close. And remember, this isn't running small test files. This is 4 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte test files there. Very different kettle of fish, you know. And the same thing goes with write. We saw much higher write performance thanks to the RAID 0 of those drives being read and accessed at the same time, thereby effectively doubling write performance there as well as read at the same time. So again, as far as Attotis benchmark was, very good numbers throughout. And again, while I'm talking to you in the corner there, we're seeing that performance with Blackmagic, again, OBS, etc. So next up, we can have a look at AJA, and the AJA test performance, as I'm sure you can already see at the bottom, was near 100% saturation in all tests. Now, as you can see, the first test there, the 256 meg test, full saturation, and even on the graph there, almost no drop down there. Next, we've got the 4 gigabyte test, I should say. Actually, let's get the 1 gigabyte test first. In the 1 gigabyte test, again, full saturation, almost no drop, just absolutely fine there all the way through and through. 4 gigabyte to gigabyte test, the tiniest scratch of a full saturation there, and again, nothing really to be too overly concerned with. And finally there at the top, full almost saturation on the 16 gigabyte test file with that RAID 0 share on that storage pool. And all the time there in the background, we've got Blackmagic chugging along there in the background. Let's cancel that down. And again, if you do want to look at the test results for Blackmagic there, we can have a little look. These are the 3 test results we saw. Let's bring that away from my face there at the top. And again, in Blackmagic, we had there the 1 gig, the 4 gig, and the the 1 gig, 3 gig, and 5 gig test respectively. So 1, 3, 5, and again, near full saturation all the way through. So clearly, if we do take advantage of that RAID 0 and those M.2 NVMes, the system can benefit from that. Now again, obviously, once again, as mentioned in the video, because we're using that 10 gigabit portal externally, we're always going to be limited to that. But internally, it's nice to know that the system is able to take advantage of the RAID 1 there throughout. And therefore, the internal performance is probably going to be noticeably greater than that 1 gigabyte. But we'll save that for the internal testing coming up in a future vid. But for now, what I'm going to do is once again make my way in to turn this RAID 0 into a RAID 1 environment there, and then from there it will allow us to run our final test just to see if there's any distinct performance that we think we might see between the 0 and the 1 externally there. So let's kill that off. We're going to remove that storage pool. That will also kill off the volume, so we'll remove that there. And what I'll do is I will bring you guys back once again around about 45 minutes to an hour for me. For you, mere seconds, lucky devil you are. And we'll go through the RAID 1 performance of the 2 M.2 NVMes here now they've enabled Synology's storage pools on the DS923. Okay, so we've made our way into our third and final part of the testing. Unsurprisingly, we can make our way in. As you can see, we've got the 2 drives there, and this time they're in the RAID 1 environment that we described, where we had the pool created there for both of those drives. So obviously, the available storage in a RAID 1, because of the mirroring there, basically halves the capacity to what we saw against the RAID 0 earlier on. On top of that, we created that shared folder. Once again, the shared folder there, recreated this time there on volume 2 once again, but this time on that RAID 1 configuration, and again the same 10 GBE setup and more all going on in the background. So again, the first test we committed there, if we bring up our shared folder, we have the shared folder there still created. We can see straight away that the first test on Atto, actually before we bring those up, why don't we run ourselves an AJA system test in the background all the time? So again, what we're going to do is a nice, let's call it a 1 gigabyte test file there running in the background on the NVMe. Again, OBS, don't look at this performance overall, look at the main results later on. But for now, let's run those tests there in the background while we go through all of the results there on screen. And again, OBS, Let's bring that there so it's continuous, so we've got something nice to look at animated in the background there. Let's just leave that there in the background. Don't be surprised if those numbers drop, by the way, as the SSDs get oversaturated during this. So while we're doing this, we can make our way onto Atto first. Atto Disk Benchmark. Let's bring up all three of those results. I'm sorry if that one's getting blocked a little bit by my face. So have a look there, trying to do about 2 or 3 things at once. Bring those up, bring that down slightly there, and then we'll bring the other one. So again, fairly comparable performance all the way through. We can ignore the IOPS ratings there. And as you can see, much like we saw in the earlier testing when we were looking at the single drive environment, quite comparable numbers there. So again, the RAID 1 there, as far as these tests are concerned, you're not really going to get that same level of performance as you saw in the individual drives, in the RAID 0 where we combine those drives, but still, nonetheless, we did still see consistent, nice high numbers there on the read performance all the way through. Again, on the 64, 256, 1 gigabit, 1 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte, and finally the 16 gigabyte there. Forgive the jumping. Again, I've been recording now for what feels like about 3 hours, and it's really gotten to my brain a little bit. So on top of that, then we've got the AJA performance there. So let's bring that up on screen. Bring it up there. So again, we've got that test running there in the background constantly, and we'll come back to that later on. But again, full saturation at the 256 megabyte line there. Again, almost full saturation there on the 1 gigabyte level there. Next up, on the 4 gigabyte level there, we saw, 2/3, 3/4 saturation there. And finally, when it came to the 16 gigabyte test file, we still saw relatively good external saturation there, again with a complex file. And finally, we can make our way into Blackmagic. Let's bring that up on there. And on Blackmagic, we saw relatively high numbers again. That was looking at a test file there of 1 gigabyte. We saw that 1000 still hit. But if we go into the results there in the background, we can get a better understanding of those stats here on the left hand side of the screen, and we can see there on the I believe that's the 1 gigabyte test file, then the 3 gigabyte test file, and then the 5 gigabyte test file there. So again, it wasn't once again until we saw the higher numbers that we saw any kind of performance deficit. So that has been all of those tests. What have we garnered from that? Well, there's a few things to take on board there. First and foremost, it is this idea that the drives that we were utilizing throughout all of our testing, because this storage pool feature of the DS923 currently only supports their own SSDs, the SNV3400 just doesn't have the high level of write that numbers would like to see. Also, there are still question marks surrounding the M.2 NVMe Bays of this system, because although by physical architecture they are Gen 3x4, digging into PuTTY and SSH on this system does reveal capped limit of 3x1 on a number of those, which again could very easily mean that drives you were going to utilize could potentially be throttled. Now, this could so easily be an early feature because it's not been fully rolled out, and something that may change over time. But changes like this are actually quite deep into the BIOS there and would require a significant update to turn those around. Again, maybe this is a feature that Synology will turn around later on as this feature is rolled out towards future updates, or this is something that Synology have insisted upon for these drives, given that the drives they're utilizing can't push more than 1,000 or so, even at the larger capacities right now in terms of sequential write. Sequential read, different story. But until we do our internal performance measures, we won't have the full story, because today's video, of course, has been an external 10G video, and therefore we're not going to be able to really capitalize and see the full performance of these drives spread its wings. This has been about seeing the capabilities of that M.2 from an external editor point of view, who are going to use that 10G connection and the M.2 pools together to see what the different RAID levels and individual drives, if they want to use the other one for cache, can bring. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's answered some of your questions. I know there are other ones out there, and we will address those other questions in the follow-up video to this very, very soon. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, chuck me a like. I know it means nothing these days with YouTube making that button near enough useless, but it helps us creators know what we're doing right. If you want to learn more, use the free advice section over on NASCompares to help you along. Use the free community forum Ask NASCompares, where me and Eddie and other users can help you, and use the links to in the description to other articles on the subject of the Synology NAS system, the DS923 in particular, and M.2 NVMe storage pools as we test more and more systems. And finally, if this video has helped you buy one of the products I've talked about today, and if you were going to buy from Amazon anyway, make sure those two things are true. Use the links in the description to take you there. Anything you buy from Amazon via those links will result in a kickback to me and Eddie here at NASCompares, as we're Amazon associates, and therefore that money goes directly back into us doing what we do. It doesn't cost you anything extra, and it helps support content creators like us. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.